How are you guys doing in the face of the pandemic?
Welcome back to the Convo Couch, everyone. I am Pasta Jardula.
And I'm Fiorella.
And Jonny Sue is still spinning on those ones and twos. And our guest knows about those ones and twos. He's a DJ himself. He is running for Congress against Nancy Pelosi. In the House, we have a good friend of the show, Shahid Buttar is here. How you doing, Shahid?
I'm doing great relative to certainly the crisis that our communities are confronting. I feel very privileged.
We're privileged to have you on the show, but we're going to start off. We're going to jump right into it. We had the CARES Act going on. We had 4 hours plus debate. They called it debate on the floor. And the whole time I was listening to these guys and gals speak, I was saying, I need Shahid in here. So what we're going to do is we're going to have you address as if you're addressing the Congress floor for the debate of the CARES Act. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from California, Shahid Buttar.
Every member of the U.S. House of Representatives is sent here by the people of the United States to guard and defend their interests and our Constitution. And every crisis presents a question of who will bear its costs. And we can choose for the costs of the coronavirus pandemic to be borne by the most vulnerable people in our society, the people who are delivering our food, the people who are preparing it, the farm workers who grow it, the gig workers who are working around the country to provide the services that we need to keep our communities safe and healthy. Or we can ensure that those costs of the coronavirus pandemic are borne by the actors most situated to bear those costs, namely large corporations and banks. It particularly makes little sense for us in this body to abandon Americans to rent payments and mortgage payments due at the beginning of a month when so many people, historic numbers, many times our previous high points, are finding themselves out of work. Our country is not prepared for this pandemic, and we need to take action to ensure that we, the people of the United States, can survive it. And if that means that some corporations don't, that's an okay decision. We were not sent here to the United States House of Representatives to represent corporations. We represent the people of the United States. And so the critical aspects to the relief that they need in this moment is not just free testing for COVID, but free treatment for the disease. A 17-year-old died in Los Angeles because he was turned away from an urgent care clinic for not having insurance. That's bad enough in a time where there's not a pandemic. During a pandemic, it is positively senseless. We must do better for each other, for our communities, and for the people we are here to represent. I yield the rest of my time.
Thank you, Speaker Buttar. Would you have voted yay or nay on this bill the way it is? And I'd just like to say, I'd like to point out the fact that you mentioned the rent situation, which nobody, not one member of the House or the floor mentioned. And you also mentioned the fact that the treatment can bankrupt or bust somebody completely financially. That was also not mentioned on the floor. So in its current state, if the bill was passed over from the Senate and you were a member, yay or nay on this bill?
I would vote for this bill and I would fight for more. I can't leave the amount of stimulus and relief that is embedded in the bill on the table, knowing how many people need it. But clearly, it's not enough by a long shot. And we need to go back to the table to make sure that the fuller needs that people are grappling with are met in this time of crisis.
So overall, what kind of grade would you give the CARES Act? I mean, looking at everything that's in it, what if that's even possible to give it a grade? But yeah, how would you rate it?
Maybe a B plus, for instance. I was very impressed that it had $500 billion in service payments and direct payments to families. I was
Hmm.
impressed that it extended benefits to students and gig workers for the first time. Those are important extensions that deserve credit. At the
Hmm.
same time, the $500 billion corporate bailout, the giveaway to Trump, is really problematic. But this is a gloss. The reason I give it a B plus and maybe not a C is because Congress did include legislative language to try to constrain potential abuses of the corporate bailout fund. The What makes it dangerous is the president issuing a signing statement saying he's not going to abide by that congressional directive. And so I would
Right.
not blame Congress for the president's unwillingness to follow the law. I think
Okay.
Congress at least took some measures to try to impose accountability. However, it got outflanked. Congress took some measures to ensure direct payments to working families. It's not nearly enough. We need to go back. Relative, however, to the strictly corporate bailout of the 2008 financial crisis, I can see very palpably demonstrated in the CARES Act the influence of the Progressive Caucus, the influence of the Squad, and particularly in the extension of unemployment benefits, the influence of the man who I still hope to be our next president, US Senator Bernie Sanders.
So just to push back on that, though, a lot of people are saying this is worse than TARP because of the even though there are provisions in there to keep corporations from just being so unregulatory in the way they're using things. I do we really buy that Congress feels like they're going to abide by that? Do we feel like it's enforceable? And also, given that it's 12 years later and the economy was already heading towards a recession before a pandemic, wouldn't we say that it was even more of a handout, considering that the corporations have already been given trillions? This is just another part of what they've been given. But the fact that there is no rent freeze, no sort of um like none of this has been taken into account as to how much people are already burdened before the pandemic, added to that right now how the situation is. It just seems pretty awful to me. And I agree with you 100% on the the added $600 on the unemployment, the added provisions for working class people, but it still feels like it's really awful.
I would agree with you, Fiorella, to the point that it's thin gruel, which is why I particularly think it's important for Congress to go back to the table and get more. I would just say that in a time of crisis, given the fight between Wall Street and the right wing and whatever semblance of economic populism we have
Hmm.
among the Democrats in the House, I think of it as imperative to secure what gains we have on the table. And I recognize that the admittedly meager but also substantially new payments for working class Americans are worth securing. And I do agree that we need not only a mortgage but a rent freeze and forgiveness. We need not only the free testing for COVID
Hmm.
and treatment for COVID, but we need free treatment for anything at the point of service.
Right.
And a lot of people get distracted by this: who's going to pay for it? I just want to make this point clear: we've been paying for it. It's just that instead of getting doctors and medicine, we get aircraft carriers and F-35 Joint Strike Fighters that aren't going to keep anybody's parents alive, and
Yeah.
they're not going to get medicine for anybody's kids, and they're not going to keep anybody from going bankrupt or homeless because you got sick. So if you have a choice between an aircraft carrier or a doctor, I hope most Americans would choose the doctor over the expensive weapons. And those are the questions before us now. And I agree with you. The American people were in crisis before. That crisis has become only more apparent now. The measures that Congress has taken to this point are entirely inadequate. And I'm glad, frankly, to see that they've taken the steps they have. And when I compare it to the 2008 bailout, what really jumps out at me, the distinction, is that at least this time around, there was a line item, and a pretty substantial one. $500 billion is nothing to sneeze at, for working Americans. And
Yeah.
in
Okay.
2008, we got nothing at all.
All right, let me jump in here real quick because this time is a little bit different than 2008. This time we have a pandemic and we've been telling people to stay at home, not to go to work. So it's a totally different situation as to why there was money in there for the people. And I think that the Democrats have a lot of responsibility and weight on their shoulders for allowing this bill to get through and not holding the line. What the Speaker tried to do after she kicked it back to the Senate so they can negotiate over there was have something called a unanimous consent voice vote, meaning that the members don't even have to show up. She told them to stay at home. And until a libertarian from friggin' Kentucky came in there and forced them to have a session, they wouldn't even had to put this on record on C-SPAN. They still got away with the voice vote, not being able to have to put it on record. They ignored his will and his asking. But, I mean, the lack of transparency from this Congress is ridiculous. Where are the progressives on this? Where is the left? All we're asking for is transparency. If they have to vote on this vote, shouldn't they go on record, Shahid?
I certainly think so. And transparency is a baseline expectation. Frankly, it's been a concern of mine in this Congress, well outside the context of the response to the pandemic, particularly in the denial of staff with security clearance to members. And that's something that Pelosi is solely and uniquely responsible for. Transparency is especially important at a time like this. It's one reason why I'm so concerned about our criminal administration being the hole in the bucket of any relief program, to the point that Fiorella was making before about the accountability and restrictions on the corporate money for the bailout funds. Congress did attempt in statutory language to reserve some accountability, and it's to our fault of our criminal president that he's telegraphed openly his intention to comply with none of it. And that is a problem. And I do think that Congress should be in a much more adversarial posture to the executive branch. I think bills that we keep hearing described as must pass need to be checked a little more frequently. That might be one way to force the administration to heal in a way that it has been to this point unwilling to do. I think with respect to this bill in particular, it's important just to realize that in the face of a pandemic, urgent action is necessary. We have to do something. And the question then becomes, what are the things that make it in? And it's this, something between a horse trading exercise and a knife fight, and everyone's, clamoring to get their line items in, get the other ones out. I think in that context, it's just important to recognize the dynamic in Washington. And I do want to give credit to the Progressive Caucus and to the squad, because without them, gig workers and students would have no protections and no resources in this bill. I think it's important for us to recognize progress when we secure it. And I don't want to say this was enough by a long shot. I do think that this bill was better than nothing. I think Congress needs to go back and get more. I think there's a paradigm shift we need to make, and this bill doesn't reflect it, but it does at least reflect the needs and the interests of the American people being taken into greater account than they have been in the past, at least to the tune of $500 billion. And know that we need more. I think, again, the rent to the mortgage moratorium and forgiveness are critical. I think that, frankly, Medicare for All is critical, because there will be other pandemics. If there's anything we should learn from this, it's that we are better off preparing for future public health crises than trying to respond to them after the fact. And the best way to do that is to make sure that the next time there's a pandemic, and ideally in the meantime, that every American can get tested for whatever the disorders are that we are alarmed about, and that they can get treatment for those disorders and diseases. And if we don't do that, we are basically inviting future pandemics to lay waste to our society. And I would hope that we in the United States collectively are smarter than that.
Well, ultimately, what it seems you're saying, and what I do tend to agree with, is that Congress, both the House and the Senate, are in a lockdown against some Republicans and against even some of our own Democrats like Nancy Pelosi. Because there's only so much you can do when you are facing people that have zero issue with people dying because of the most basic things, right? So there were people like Lindsey Graham who were upset at the provisions of giving people $600 on top of their unemployment, and they by no means wanted that to pass. And so what we're facing here are a Congress of majorly psychopaths who have zero problem killing people, and who think of the poor as less deserving than everybody else. No, they should have absolutely the least amount of money because it's their fault they're poor. And this is what we're facing here. You talk about a paradigm shift. The paradigm shift is us realizing just how bad it is. And I agree with you. People were demanding something needed to pass. If people voted against that, it went back and forth. Meanwhile, people get nothing. And so while I do think it is absolutely horrible, I do see your point that something has to get done. And when you don't have the support of when you don't have a majority of the numbers as progressives, that's just not going to happen. Now, how bad is it in the House right now? Do you think this is all kabuki theater? Aside from AOC, who was one of the only people who pretty much mentioned Wall Street, I know we have Ilhan in there, Rashida, but how bad do you think Congress is, and what do you think about the influence of the progressive wing of the party in the bill? You kind of started talking about that.
Yeah, I appreciate you raising it. And the only place I'd maybe press back is when you described the GOP being sociopaths and willing to commit people to death to protect corporate profit. The only thing I would press back on there is that entirely too many corporate Democrats have been
absolutely.
willing.
Absolutely, yeah.
We don't forget about that.
Oh, no.
Not on this show. Please.
Nancy Pelosi, she's an angel. Come on.
Well, and it's a point worth, sort of bearing on in two different contexts here, both the Medicare for all and the debate over how do we treat healthcare. Is it like the yacht club or is it like the fire department? And we should be giving medical care according to need. That's not crazy. To pay for medical care in an age when our public shared interest in public health is so obvious, just, it really doesn't even meet the needs of the present, let alone the future. When we look at the Progressive Caucus, when we look at Congress, I see the Progressive Caucus gaining increasing influence, and I see the CARES Act reflecting it. I see the emergence of the squad as a welcome development. It is, to some extent, a measure of Nancy Pelosi's influence that she's managed to successfully embrace the squad and encourage a rhetorical détente, such that, they now call her Mama Bear. She went to Africa with Ilhan Omar. Nancy Pelosi, I think, recognized that the squad is the future and intelligently, given the need to defend her own legacy and career, chose to conciliate with them rather than continue punching down, for instance, at Ilhan Omar. I'm glad that she stopped punching down at Ilhan Omar in public. I've heard voices online clamor for members of the squad to endorse me. And while I just want to be clear, I would be over the moon should any of them choose to endorse me. I also recognize that they have to work on Capitol Hill, and their boss for the moment is the Speaker of the House. And the last thing I want to do is complicate the work of any of my allies who are already in Washington. I'm auditioning to join them. I want to expand their ranks. I want to help them. Me getting in their way doesn't help them. So I'm happy to let the endorsements go and let them do their jobs in the meantime. Each of them independently had to find their way to Washington. I expect to need to do the same. And I'm happy to travel that road. And I hope by removing Nancy Pelosi, ultimately to create a lot of space for them to operate. She runs Congress in a way that both leverages sticks and carrots. That is to say, incentives for members to comply with her directives and support the votes that she whips for, and also penalties for people who cross her. Penalties like, committee assignments being unavailable, penalties like party support being unavailable. And it's the reason why I think so many incumbents in the Democratic Party have been unwilling to challenge the corporate paradigm, is because the leader of the Democrats in the House runs the caucus with a certain reflection of an authoritarian sensibility. And it methodologically, as much as substantively, that violates, I think, our democratic norms, and certainly does not comport with my vision of democracy and the vision of democracy that brought my family here from abroad. I see the voices of progressives in Congress getting louder also in policy. And you see this, free testing for COVID, that's a relatively, and it's not as expansive as I'd wish, that's a relatively socialist program. You can't tell me that would have passed Congress before the emergence of the squad. Certainly didn't have GOP support. And I don't know how many corporate Democrats would have supported it if they didn't have the young progressive voices of Congress's most visionary members holding them to account. There are other areas also where I see the Squad and the Progressive Caucus's influence growing ascendant, for instance, in the context of encouraging Congress to assert increasingly assertive congressional war powers vis-a-vis our criminal president. I think at least the rhetoric and the discourse, if not the policy surrounding the Green New Deal and climate change and climate chaos reflects the rising influence of progressives on the Hill. I think we need a lot more, and it's one of the reasons I'm running to remove one of the principal gatekeepers of the corporate Democratic Party.
It's also a fair criticism to say that if somebody in Congress supports a outsider to primary against the opponent, like in other words, if AOC would support Asima Hernandez or some of these other progressives, and then that progressive loses to that Democrat that's already holding that seat, that incumbent, for her to go back and try to work with that incumbent might be hard in Congress as well. And I understand that. However, I just want to point out right now that I think you're propping up and being a little bit too fair to the Progressive Caucus and the Squad and the progressives within Congress, because they, in my personal opinion, they didn't hold the line. They didn't do enough in this bill. It didn't have to be 96-0 in the Senate. It should have been 94-2, and there should have been a lot more people on the floor like AOC. Ilhan Omar completely walked away from this whole situation when she was used to calling out lobbyists. Remember the AIPAC thing? Well, a lot of lobbyists wrote this bill. And I just want to say the other day that Matt Stoller, who does follow a lot of these bailouts on the floor, said on the Jimmy Dore show, it's time for the progressives in the movement to grow up and learn how to govern. I mean, isn't he right at this point? I mean, isn't it time for progressives to start watching more C-SPAN to understand how to govern and the tricks and trades that go on the floor?
Yes, and I think, I've seen Matt I've known him for over a decade when we were both in Washington under the Bush administration. And I think one of the things he's getting at is there is a long-standing pattern here of the 1% in corporations claiming resources during times of crisis. I see him particularly responding to what I describe as the latest iteration of Naomi Klein's shock doctrine illustrated in front of us, where there's a social crisis, there's a question of who's going to bear the cost, and go figure, corporations are out there lobbying to make sure that working Americans pay the costs and that they don't have to. And that we've seen that pattern in the world over and over again. I see that pattern also played out in policy over and over again. We've touched on some examples, like with pharmaceutical companies and health insurance companies fleecing the American public by requiring us to be, allowed healthcare at the barrel of a financial gun. Similarly, I see in the military-industrial complex this co-optation of our resources to horrible effect abroad and domestically. I think what he's getting at ultimately is the horror of bipartisan corporate rule. And to your point about the Squad and the progressives, we certainly don't have enough votes yet to overcome the corporatists. I just want to be clear about that. I think the voices in the Squad have done everything they can with minority positions. I've seen each of them leverage the oversight context brilliantly. I see them, maybe not as assertively in public as some of us might wish, challenging the consensus, but I think they're in there and expanding the set of issues. I think they're making the case for more equitable distribution. I think they're making the case against corporate corruption. And I do think when we have the votes to overcome the centrists in the middle, that you'll see very different decisions coming out of Congress. I'm a little hesitant to criticize my allies only because, frankly, I hope to join them and empower them and embolden them. And I recognize that they are fighting in a context where, frankly, they don't have the votes to stop
Right.
Wall Street.
Absolutely.
Wall Street has the votes still.
Yeah, they don't have the votes. You're right. Absolutely, 100%. Now, again, though, we are in the middle of a crisis, an unprecedented crisis, and we have not only an economic crisis but a health crisis, and then we also obviously have a healthcare related crisis because people aren't going to be able to pay for these treatments after the fact, and that's not even covered by this resolution. Now, what do we have time? Do we have time to wait until we get enough votes? Because I'm looking at the timeline of climate change. I'm looking at the timeline of this country. And frankly, the whole idea has always been to be Dem enter and go inside and try to take over the Democratic Party. But what I'm looking at right now is that the Democratic Party is on its last leg, and the way the Democratic Party is behaving, even in spite of people like the progressive wing of the Democratic Party, it's not enough to keep it alive. What they're doing with Joe Biden, their silence on his acts, the way they manipulate the narrative via the mainstream media, the way our elections lack integrity. How is that enough to continue fighting for a party or in the existence of a party? And what can people do to get our Congress members to work for us when there's this such a big situation that's so convoluted?
On this point about the Democratic Party, I could not agree with you more that the Democratic Party has been taken from us. The Democratic Party at one point in time, you might have thought of as a Labor Party. It hasn't been a Labor Party in 40 years.
Yep.
And my attitude to the Democratic Party is that it's part of the problem and we have to remove the leadership. That's what I'm running to do. I am in the reason I'm running for Congress. I'm in the third year of a race to dethrone the party leader for precisely all of the reasons that you mentioned. So I could not agree more. And I would say that the critique is important. More important than the critique is building the alternatives. And I think that's what people can do, is build alternatives. Some of those can be local. In the last couple of weeks, I've had the opportunity to bag groceries with the San Francisco Marin Food Bank. We bought a bunch of N95 particulate masks for the last wildfire season, anticipating that we'd be handing those out for the wildfires. Thankfully, the wildfire season wasn't as bad as we feared. So we took those masks and we delivered them to Glide Memorial Methodist Church, where people here in the Tenderloin have been serving meals and services to at-risk, particularly unhoused folks in our communities. There's a lot of ways that people from the local level to the national level. One example, if the issues that we're talking about now concern some of your listeners, for instance, we're going to be soon, because the pandemic has forced us as a campaign to forego many traditional campaign tactics. We can't knock on doors anymore. We can't do voter mobilizations. We can't do events, but we can pick up the phone. So we're doubling down on phone banking and text banking. So anyone and anywhere in the country can participate in that effort. So if you want to see Medicare for all, if you want to see an end to mass incarceration that is creating another disease contagion vector, if you want to see our society get on the front end of the next pandemic, I just invite your viewers to check us out online at shahidforchange.us and sign up to volunteer, or if you don't have time and are pressed for that and in a position to contribute, make a campaign contribution. But this is a time when people can build alternatives from their own neighborhoods to these critical races to flip key seats. And I do want to make this point clear. There are three races, I think, that I would describe as having the greatest national significance. One of them, I do very much hope that it's Bernie versus Trump in November, because we will win that fight. Biden versus Trump leaves Trump in the White House for 4 years. We can't risk that. So I do hope very much that Bernie's the nominee. Setting that race aside, McConnell versus his opponents in Kentucky, and my race against Pelosi in November, I will be the first Democratic Party challenger that Pelosi has ever faced in a November election. And my job is to make sure that it is the last November election that she has an opportunity to contest. And as much as I agree with you that the Progressive Caucus doesn't have the influence yet that we hope that it to have, I'm not observing it. I'm auditioning to join it. And I am watching the principal impediment to its agenda, that being the most powerful corporate politician on the planet, keep her boot on the neck of the aspirations of a generation that is struggling to bear with multiple compounding crises. So I aim not to defend the corporate Democratic Party. I aim to take the Democratic Party over on behalf of we the people of the United States, and to recover a Labor Party representing our interests. I agree with you that we don't have, the generation to wait that it might take normally to secure a legislative majority. Thankfully, I think a lot of people are waking up in this moment of crisis to recognize that we do need to make very long overdue and increasingly urgent choices. And, there were bipartisan majorities favoring universal health care before the pandemic. And it makes the case for us to share our resources in the face of shared calamities better than I or Bernie Sanders or anyone on the squad, better than any of us could ever make it. The facts are endorsing Bernie Sanders. The facts are endorsing a socialist future. And I hope that the facts help educate enough Americans about the need for us to make different choices and get on the front end of these problems before more people end up, the victims of preventable deaths.
A couple things I want to point out before we get to the next subject, being the Patriot Act, because I don't know if you know this, Shahid. I'm a civil liberties guy, and I want to talk a little Patriot Act renewal and stuff like that. But the things that I wanted to point out is, number one, this bill was very much like the Patriot Act. It was 900 pages, and they had 24 hours to look at this thing again, and they just ram it through Congress, and that's something bad. I also want to point out the UBI that was first brought to the table had bipartisan support, and I think that's a positive thing because it was only one page, and that was with Tulsi, Tom Cotton, Ilhan Omar jumped on that, Mitt Romney, and I like to see that kind of diversity in Congress when people are willing to support that bill. And then also, too, as well, Rashida Tlaib, two-page bill, and I thought that was the most important one. And I really thought the squad and everybody else should have stood behind something like this. You know, hey, this is just relief for the people. We're going to pass this first before we pass anything else and make a stand on it. Put your flag in the ground. It was 2 pages, her bill, and it was very easy for the American people to understand. So I hope going forward that when you get in Congress, you can write smaller bills where the people can understand, and you can give them more than 24 hours to read it and get lobbyist hands off that stuff. So that's just a hope for the future.
Those are quotations I'm happy to take.
You got it. I just want to read some quick super chats. Oz LaFave said, "We love Shahid. Your Washington State supporters. Land of Oz. They're in the house for you today, Shahid. They love you." Allison says, "Keep challenging them, please." Thank you for the super chat contribution. And I believe we have one more. Was that the only 2, Johnny? That was the only 2. Let's get on to the next subject. Patriot Act. Fam.
So the Patriot Act was signed into law shortly after the 9/11 attacks. In the bill, it allows the government to expand on the definition of what terrorism is, with the capability of always moving our goalposts, which is something we do. Won't the military-industrial complex constantly create new enemies and then obviously constantly have the need to implement a new Patriot Act or amend it and add to it?
Whether the problems are created or not, the military-industrial complex certainly acts opportunistically in seeking and claiming more powers in times of crisis. I don't want to, for instance, say that I don't think the pandemic was created by a military-industrial complex, but it certainly, just as it was after the 9/11 attacks, it was waiting in the wings and seized immediately on the opportunity to claim new powers. The Patriot Act is a story of the Project for a New American Century having proposed surveillance measures and other powers that Congress rightfully had rejected before the 9/11 attacks, and then dusting those proposals off a shelf and ramming them through a compliant, fearful Congress in the days following the attacks. Now, in the face of the pandemic, Nancy Pelosi and other centrists in Congress have whipped votes for and argued for the extension of Patriot Act powers. It's remarkably disturbing that Pelosi was outflanked by McConnell on civil liberties in the last week, which I think is just a gross representation of the speaker's failure as a leader of the Democrats in Congress. And to see voices that have clamored repeatedly for extensions of Patriot Act powers that were set to expire, now continuing to do so even after some of those powers, particularly Section 215, that's the business records provision, sometimes known as the library records provision, it has officially expired, as it has been scheduled to do so on multiple occasions in the past, at every one of which Congress has scrambled at the last minute without any hearings, without any evidence, saying, oh my God, the sky's going to fall. We must reauthorize this law or we're all going to die. And that law has finally expired. And there's plenty of Americans dead, but not from problems that surveillance would have fixed, right? That's the issue here, is that we have been sold a false bill of goods. And neither the Patriot Act nor surveillance generally stands in for security. What they stand in for is corruption. These are career insulating, not national security promoting initiatives. I'm very eager to see the transparent, going to Pasta's question from before, transparent public debate over these powers that never happened when they were first proposed, that has not happened in the years since, that is long overdue, and a debate, incidentally, that the national security agencies cannot win because these powers don't actually keep us safe. All they do is suck the resources out of the federal treasury that could otherwise go towards things like doctors and medicine that we actually need. Beyond surveillance, there's another piece here of the civil liberties crisis that has gone widely underreported. And I'm alarmed that to this point, as far as I know, only Newsweek and Politico have even written single stories, and neither of them more than one, about a letter written by Attorney General Barr to Congress seeking the statutory authority to invite chief justices of district courts to suspend habeas corpus.
Mm-hmm.
That's incredibly dangerous power at any time, let alone when it's an aspiring tyrant in the White House. Our president is a criminal who knows no bounds, either legal or normative. We cannot give Donald Trump or a government led by him the authority to detain Americans without charge or trial. That will be the end of our democracy if we let it be. And every member of Congress, before even joining the body, swore an oath specifically for moments like this to defend the Constitution. And I implore my future colleagues to show up for work. This is not a time to put career before country. We must put bedrock constitutional norms and rights at the front of our decisions. There is enormous peril if we let the right to trial slip through our fingers, especially at a time like that.
Well, let's not forget about those corporate Democrats, those corrupt Democrats, because more Democrats voted yay on the Patriot Act renewal than Republicans in this one. So they're aiding and abetting that tyrant, that criminal president. And the bill was introduced itself by Jerry Nadler, okay, a Democrat. And isn't it time we start stapling these bills, the face to the name to the bill itself? I mean, it was created in the House by this guy who keeps renewing it time and time and time again. Isn't it time we said, hey, this is the guy who put forth this legislation, whether he's a Republican or a Democrat? Because you're mentioning that Trump's the corrupt criminal. Well, Jerry Nadler enabled him with this bill.
I don't disagree that the House leadership, by promoting bills that extend the authorization deadlines, prove complicit. I've made that point myself. Jerry Nadler in particular, I'll just say that there are worse members of Congress, and I'm grateful that he, at least in the context of the impeachment saga, said publicly that the reason that the emoluments clause was not part of the impeachment process, that's the charge that would have brought the president down. The reason it wasn't is because of Nancy Pelosi. So I give Jerry Nadler the credit for giving the transparency to the backroom deal that the rest of us couldn't have seen.
But he authored this bill, Shahid. I mean, what credit can we give him when he authored the Patriot Act? If he does one good thing, it doesn't make a difference when he does something that's just solely so bad right here in this Patriot Act.
Yeah, I want to distinguish Nadler's role over time. So he, as the chair of the House Judiciary Committee, he ends up in this position, and he is an institutionalist first, and that's what you're describing, and you're absolutely right. It's one reason why I back his challenger. But the point I just want to make here is that there are many Democrats, particularly Nancy Pelosi, who are frankly worse. I mean, Nadler's positions on civil liberties are consistently to the more liberty side than Pelosi. Pelosi is the hammer. And, among the House leadership, I think of Jerry Nadler as frankly not nearly as authoritarian as many of his colleagues. And when I think about the authors of the Patriot Act, I mean, that was James Sensenbrenner. That was a Republican from Wisconsin who, to your point, when Snowden came forward and said how the Patriot Act was being revealed, James Sensenbrenner said, oh, yeah, I take it back. I actually don't support any of that. That's not what I was trying to legislate. I was trying to create a robust targeted surveillance authority. And what Snowden revealed was a mass surveillance authority. And I think you're absolutely right. This danger of Republicans outflanking Democrats because Democrats have moved so close to the center that they're now creating opportunities for right-wing politicians to claim their support. This is how Trump got in the White House, because Democrats were moved so close to Wall Street that he was able to say, I am the outsider candidate here as a billionaire oligarch. Right? And how preposterous is that? But that's the danger in this centrist moderation. To the point that I would particularly just like hew to in your comments and agree with you on is the need to defend principles at a time like this. And I think it's important also that we hold legislators accountable. I think the idea of putting the name on the bill matters. I just also, again, recognize that my future colleagues are operating in contexts that in many cases are very unfortunate. And I don't want to give credit where it's undue, but I also don't want to give fault where it's undue either. I would like to see the chair of the House Judiciary Committee write the bill to say, we're going to end these programs. That would be the better maneuver to take. I recognize that he feels some pressure to keep these things operating. At the end of the day, that's why we need new voices in Congress who will not feel beholden to these bad decisions, that will not feel beholden to these corrupt agencies, new voices that will feel beholden to the people that we are elected to represent, and that's our neighbors, we the people of the United States.
So the members who voted for the Patriot Act say they support it because it helps protect us from terrorists. And a lot of these same members like Adam Schiff, Nancy Pelosi, Debbie Wasserman Schultz also support the idea of Russiagate. Is there a correlation between the two?
That's a fascinating question that I frankly haven't quite considered in those terms. I think that there is a correlation between people who are willing to accept the lies of intelligence agencies across contexts.
Mhm.
And so that at least there's a correlation for you. You know, it's the very same intelligence agencies that have beat the drums in each of those arenas. I think that it's important for members of Congress to demonstrate the independence to evaluate information for themselves. And the PCLOB stands for the Privacy and Civil Liberties Oversight Board. It was a body whose creation was recommended by the bipartisan 9/11 Commission. And the PCLOB, in assessing these powers that were set to and have since expired, has determined that they've never actually been helpful in protecting national security. So whoever says or claims without evidence that these powers help keep us safe, I would just invite them to demonstrate the independence, to read the facts and discover that in fact that is not true. That's just an NSA, CIA, FBI talking point. It doesn't match the reality on the ground. These programs don't keep us safe. They just consume our resources, and they particularly could be used behind walls of executive secrecy to keep us silent. That is the danger. People think of these programs through a security lens and not a social control lens. As a proud American, I look at them through a constitutional lens as assaults and restrictions on freedom and the right to conscience and dissent. That's the appropriate way to think about surveillance, not as a security protecting regime, if only because the facts in our history suggest that surveillance has always been more about suppressing somebody's speech
Mhm.
than about keeping anybody safe.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Thank you, fam. Our civil liberties. I talk about it all the time. This ain't about safety and protection. This is about control. And most people just heard of the name Thomas Massie last week, but for some of us who were cheering him on when he was calling out Nancy Pelosi for what she tried to do with the Patriot Act with that 72-hour rule, when she tried to hide the language on the bill by suspending their own rules. I mean, at this point right now, Shahid, isn't Pelosi more dangerous than Trump? Because Trump has, 4 more years if he gets elected? You know, Pelosi can be there forever. And she keeps on enabling whoever's in office, whether it had been Obama last time, Clinton and Bush before them. I mean, your thoughts on that? I know you're running against Nancy Pelosi, but I personally think that I said this before, and some people said you're crazy. I said it's more important to get rid of Pelosi right now than it is to get rid of Trump. Your thoughts?
I would certainly agree with that, and I wouldn't say it's because she's more dangerous than him. I think you kind of gave me two different questions, and the second one was much easier. I don't know if she's more dangerous than Trump, but I do agree that it's more important to remove her from office than Trump, because as long as she is in office, Trump doesn't have real opposition. She is the voice that enables him by taking the Democratic Party off the table as a meaningful check on his avarice and fiat. And as long as she is willing to treat the Defense Authorization Act as a must-pass bill, as long as she's willing to give him $4.5 billion appropriations to build border detention camps, as long as she's willing to support his trade deals, to slow walk impeachment processes that fail as a result, she has been such an either ineffective or alternatively complicit opposition leader that I think, as we think about accountability, we need accountability not just at the top, but also for failed opposition to our criminal president.
Absolutely.
And so we think that the accountability is necessary to enable meaningful opposition. So to that extent, yes, full stop. I absolutely agree that we need new voices in Congress, both to enable stronger opposition to potential kleptocracy, observed kleptocracy in Washington, and also to remove the ossified generation of leaders who have proven themselves unable or unwilling to meet the needs of the president.
What's that word ossified mean, fam?
Why are you asking me? I should.
Because you're the English. What's ossified?
I don't want to say the wrong thing.
You're throwing out big words here, Shahid, so I'm just going to take it as a sign of,
It's fossilized. It's like the entrenched, very old, entrenched, unaccountable.
I'll go back and look it up. I just did it, my vocabulary is not the best at time. Special thanks.
Towards an older person. That's where I was struggling. But
Nancy Pelosi.
I thought we were talking about older person. We're talking about me here.
That's what I would.
Super chat contributions. Costello says Shahid is apologizing for Nadler's GTFO. They don't like you apologizing for Nadler, especially when he was such a huge Russiagate. I mean, Jerry Nadler said the attempts by the Russians to fix the elections was just as tragic of an attack as 9/11. I think he said something to that degree. It was almost on the same level. And Jerry Nadler, to me,
I'm not defending Jerry Nadler. I just have my hands full with Nancy Pelosi, so I'm not trying to make enemies. I don't. But that's as far as I'm going.
None Your Business says suggestions in response to election fraud. Donate $1. Election fraud. You want to jump into that real quick and tell us what you think? Because on this show, we're election integrity activists, as well as, having a show here. And that's something we go into hard. We study deep. We talk to a lot of professions. We followed the whole LA election last time. I feel that Bernie Sanders' biggest sin is the fact that he hasn't called out election fraud and challenged some of this voting. And not even the fact, tell everybody, educate everybody that all our computers and our systems, our software, are owned by corporations. There's proprietary software. What's your thought on election fraud in general?
So I think that it happens, and I think that we have a lot of problems confronting the legitimacy of our elections. I wouldn't fault Bernie for not making a bigger deal of it, only because he's a candidate, and frankly, we are in particularly vulnerable positions to challenge the fairness of the processes that we're auditioning to be evaluated under. That really has to come from other actors. And I would say that the divergences between the exit polls and the observed official results are more than suspicious. That's enough in any other context for people to declare the results illegitimate. I really wish that the press would demonstrate some independence here. And I applaud your view of these issues. I think the fact that the corporate media, and I'd even also fault the international media for accepting the cue of the corporate media and describing our election results as legitimate, even when there's objective indicia to the contrary. I think that's an irresponsible act of journalism, and I think we're all paying a cost as a result. On the particular threat vectors that threaten the legitimacy of our elections, I want to expand the frame. I'll put it this way. You don't need a computer to hack an election. The GOP has been hacking our elections in broad daylight for decades.
So have the Democrats.
And
so have the Democrats.
But just to locate how, every time they purge the rolls and qualified voters who are entitled to vote are denied the opportunity, that's hacking an election. Every time a Secretary of State denies voting machines to an urban enclave where then you have these waits for hours long and people go home and before casting a vote, that's hacking an election. Every time you have well-funded candidates going to the polls, raising 20 times their competitors because they're sucking up corporate cash, that's hacking an election. Our elections at multiple different points in the process suffer from legitimacy problems. And so I just want to make that point that our elections are ridden with holes. The role of money in constructing campaign finance, the role of money in policy, in the lobbying apparatus, the way that we count votes with exclusive points for first place in most elections. I have the opportunity to be Nancy Pelosi's first November challenger from within the party ever. And the reason why is because in California, we have a somewhat unique structure for congressional elections, the jungle primary, that in a place like San Francisco allows points for second place. And so I'm in the November election as the second place vote getter in March. That might sound like a not big deal, but giving points for second place is the difference between having a multiplicity of parties and having two parties. And as long as you have a two-party system, it's going to be really hard to get to anything meaningfully resembling democracy because the parties will treat each side of the election spectrum, as it were, as hostages. We, the American people, are held largely hostage by the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. Where do you go if you're not one of those parties? Well, in most of America, there is no place for you politically. That's one of the reasons why I'm running against the head of the Democratic Party, and I'm ultimately aiming to democratize the United States. And I think the key impediment to us having a meaningful democracy is the corporate leadership of the party that describes itself falsely as democratic.
Yeah.
I'm going to push back unless you got something.
Yeah, well, and I was just going to say, like in California, for instance, in Los Angeles, we had one of the worst elections of our time. I mean, we had provisional ballots being given to people because they couldn't find them in the system, even though they've been registered for years. We had the machines not working, spitting out ballots. We had 3, 4, 5, 6-hour-long lines. That is a form of voter suppression. It's also a form of voter suppression when you tell people they have 11 days to vote, but the machines aren't ready yet. All of this is forms of voter suppression, but election fraud is also something that not only the Republican Party does, but the Democratic Party. We know we have Secretary of State Alex Padilla and Dean Logan, who is the clerk, and they knew we were talking about all these problems before March 3rd, and they knew, and they didn't do anything about it. They led people to feel like everything was fine. And that is the corruption, and that corruption comes from obviously the top. And I agree with you that Bernie Sanders may not be in a position to necessarily say something, but I think the time for that has passed. I think right now more than ever, obviously the people need to speak out about it, and the corporate media is obviously going to ignore it, which is why we do it. But I mean, I need to see it more from people, from candidates running for Congress, because are we ever going to get anything that we want? Whether it's the Green New Deal, Medicare for all, when we have not only to fight the Democrats and the Republicans, but also the system that enables them to continuously stay on top. We've seen the situation between Debbie Wasserman Schultz and Tim Canova. We've also seen other progressives go against these big corporate politicians, and it's very, very hard for us to win. And sometimes it is because not enough people are aware of the progressive issues. But more often than not, I think it's because the system is set up against us. And that is something that I think we have to more stop being afraid to call it election fraud in general from our entire government. Start talking about it as a non-taboo thing, because when we talk about it as a taboo thing, then people start like being afraid to even say the words, oh, it's rigged, or this is fraud, etc.
I mean, my first case as a young lawyer in 2003, even before I graduated from law school, I was working on a case defending the House co-sponsors, Shays and Meehan, of the Bipartisan Campaign Reform Act of 2003. This was the McCain-Feingold attempt to take corporate soft money out of elections. So like, I get it. The first work I did in my legal career was trying to defend a bipartisan congressional attempt to take corporate soft money out of elections to diminish the reality and appearance of corruption. And when we were successful in that case before the DC Circuit, before the Supreme Court in the Citizens United decision, then reversed effectively the rules that we helped establish in those cases. And so I'm absolutely on board, and I absolutely agree that it needs to be a clamoring, a chorus of voices.
Yeah.
And I think for us as candidates, and I do talk about the threats to our election legitimacy as policy issues, but for a campaign having in the wake of an election to allege election fraud is just a challenging position to be in. And I'd much rather see those observations coming from academics, poll watchers, international observers, and journalists, because they're in strong positions to report the fact. Whereas anyone will perceive a politician or a campaign's presentation of the facts as inevitably and inherently self-interested and inflected with that view. And so I think this is a real need for real independent journalism of the sort that you all are practicing. I really hope that more journalists can take your cue and invite attention to these issues. And every time an exit poll diverges from the result, that divergence should be the top line of every news report on that election. And too often we see what passes for news reduced to stenography. Here's the official result. Well, if it doesn't match the exit polls, say that, because people need to know. I really do agree with you that those are important issues for us to be kept aware of in this important time.
But Shahid, why are you saying that Bernie Sanders doesn't have a responsibility to call it out? He's the one who got cheated. You know what I'm saying? I'm not trying to make this all about, I'm not trying to put everything on Bernie Sanders' shoulder, whatnot. I understand there's a lot of pressure when it comes to this particular subject. It seems to be taboo at sorts. Like I can see some of his campaign managers maybe telling him, hey, listen, don't say there's rigging. You're going to look like a sore loser, and it's going to really turn off most of the country. However, this has happened before in 2016, and now it's happening in 2020. Isn't it his position? Shouldn't Bernie Sanders take the position that he has to fight for everyone's vote to be counted and do what's necessary, and at the very least have a lawsuit against some of these states that have had just serious problems with their exit polls? Go ahead.
I don't think that's a crazy position. I think there's a lot of merit to what you're saying. I certainly think that he has gone to bat for everybody's right to vote. He's talked about it very explicitly and made the point that if you can't win a free and fair election, I think this is a direct quote, "Get the hell out of politics," is what he has said to those figures. So I think he has, on the front end, called for fair elections. I don't think the idea of a lawsuit is crazy. I think it makes sense to defend the integrity of our elections, and I also don't think that he shouldn't talk about it. The only point I'm raising here is that I think the people that we rely on to share facts, namely reporters, journalists. That's what the press is for, to call out misrepresentations, to observe where the official facts and the facts on the ground diverge. That's not to say that politicians can't or shouldn't do that. We do. I think Bernie does. I certainly do. Just the point I'm making is that I don't think we are in the strongest position to do it, because people will recognize anything we say as inflected by a political perspective, as distinct from an empirical commitment to what is happening on the ground. We're all very embedded in facts. I mean, it is the fact of human misery and suffering that drives me to advocate for Medicare for all. It is the fact of climate chaos in our species, runaway corporate resource extraction racket in driving it, that is driving me to advocate for the Green New Deal. I just mean to say that I think looking to politicians to critique the legitimacy of the election infrastructure places us in an unfortunate position. And frankly, I think there are stronger voices to make that case. And I think that again, that journalists are the strongest actors to reflect upon the difference between fact and spin in our society. And the fact that so many of your counterparts, particularly in the institutional media, refuse to call out the spin and present it as uncritical fact, I think that's 9/10 of the reason we're in this mess. That we've been spoon-fed supposed facts that are anything but for decades. And I think the real facts of the matter are that working people fuel our economy. Working people always take it on the chin. In times of crisis, we get abused even more relentlessly. And at the end of the day, we have elected representatives who, in more cases than not, are out there defending our corporate masters instead of our families and our students and our working and our neighbors in between jobs. Working class Americans are the ones who need representation and need a voice right now. And I hear you saying that voice hasn't been present, that our elections don't heed our voices either. Could not agree with you more. At the end of the day, all I can hope for is that enough of my neighbors turn out to support our voices, that the illegitimacies and obstacles confronting our victories are insufficient to keep us from victory. And I'll be very eager to legislate those reforms that you think might replicate the Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act that the Supreme Court struck down, ensure national vote by mail opportunities, ensure same-day registration opportunities, and go to bat for those values at times when, unfortunately, both Republicans and many Democrats have chosen not to.
Yeah, and I see no problem with fighting for transparency. These elections are owned by our corporations, and that's something that's going to be pointed out. And I think it's up to the politicians or the candidates who are running for the progressives to educate people. I mean, Fiorella is doing a story right now. She just released a video about what's going on in Wisconsin. I don't think the general public understands that the early voting is more moderate to conservative and the late voting is more liberal to progressive. And that's just a pattern that goes throughout our history as far as voting. And when the Democrats pull these moves, and Fiorella's they're still going on in Wisconsin right now. We need the people who are running to represent us, to fight for our votes, to point out and educate those points. And the fact that we are in a proprietary software system, we can't even look in, like when people say, you can't prove to me that it's rigged, I'm like, you can't prove to me that it's not rigged, because we can't simply look into the black box. We don't own it, and we pay for it, but yet we don't own it.
Auditable elections are critical. I want to absolutely meet you there. There's no reason to have elections being conducted by proprietary information. There's no legitimate role for proprietary information in so crucial a public process. I mean, I would say that there's no role for proprietary information and algorithms in any public process. We think about bail and sentencing determinations often being informed by artificial intelligence and machine learning. That's all illegitimate too. If it's a public decision, it should be a transparent decision. And if it's a private algorithm or a piece of software, it's not transparent by definition. We need to have auditable elections where we can verify the results in order to have trust in them. If a reporter can't verify the results of an election, they shouldn't report the results as legitimate, presumptively, especially when there's divergences from the exit poll. So I agree with you. We who are seeking elections should be calling these issues out. I just want to, again, invite the press to be part of that process, because without it, I don't think that message is going to get heard. And again, I'm very thankful for you, using your platform to draw attention to these issues. I think more journalists need to do it.
Thank you.
Anything else?
No.
Johnny, he's here for almost an hour now. You got anything else? Shahid, thank you so much for spending some time. I just want to say that Greg One Love, Super Chat says the Democratic Party cannot be transformed from the inside. Your thoughts on that before we get out of here real quick?
Yeah, I mean, you could think of me as inside if you think of someone who is registered as a Green Party person for 15 years and, was arrested fighting Bush's wars and arrested challenging Obama's surveillance and, has fought in the courts and in the streets against, all of their abuses and Trump's corruption. You could think of me as inside the Democratic Party, but I am very much an outsider running to take the leader of the Democratic Party out of that position. So, I don't know exactly what reform from within the party means, but running an immigrant Muslim to take out the most powerful corporate politician on the planet, I don't think of that as an inside fight in any way. And, particularly to the people want to get new voices in there. I'm happy to be an outlet for that outrage.
This other guy, Democracy, says you can't take over an anti-revolutionary party. I said, wait for Shahid Buttar to get in there. He's going to get him with his dance moves. Shahid, where can we find you? Where can we help you out so you can beat the speaker?
I appreciate that. Online at shahidforchange.us or on Twitter, Facebook, or Instagram at shahidforchange.
60 Minutes with Shahid Buttar. Thank you so much. Good luck in
Shahid.
your fight.
Appreciate you.
For Pasta Jardula,
Fiorella.
Jonny Sue on the ones and twos. Shahid Buttar going to
CONVO out.
take out the speaker.
Peace.